Hi, I want to introduce you to a superhero of mine, Jesse Lewis. Jesse was 6 when a gunman entered his elementary school and opened fire. Jesse heard a sound he recognized, the sound of a gun jamming. He immediately yelled for his classmates to run. Jesse saved 6 lives that day because he recognized an opportunity and he acted on it. Let's talk about our traditional emergency management outreach programs. Typically, we talk to adults and we're trying to help them recognize opportunities as well. Opportunities to prepare, opportunities to respond, and opportunities to recover. Well, I hope what you see by the end of this little talk is that perhaps maybe we're not focusing on the right group. Perhaps we ought to be talking about a different group, children. So children are affected by disaster, without a doubt. In the United States, almost 25% of our population is comprised of children. And the United Nations estimates that over half of those affected by disaster are children or youth, youth being the age bracket of 18 to 25 years old. Fukushima, for example, 30% of those seen by the DMATs, the Disaster Medical Assistance Teams, were children. And we look at COVID as another example. I don't think there's a child out there that hasn't been affected. They may not have had COVID, or their family might not, but they've experienced school closures, childcare closures, and closures of a lot of normal things like the playground down the street. Children are impacted physically by disaster. They're more vulnerable to injury, illness, death. They have different circulatory and respiratory rates, so a lot of times the bad stuff gets in quicker. They're vulnerable to heat stress, malnutrition, sexual or physical abuse. In addition, physically, they're a little different from us mobility-wise. Not all of them walk yet. They crawl or turn over. Or if they're like my son a couple of years ago, and he can manage to ricochet off 3 different objects when traversing a straight line. Still haven't figured that one out. Children are also impacted emotionally by disaster. They suffer PTSD, depression, anxiety. They might have nightmares. They would regress potentially with different behaviors. Separation anxiety, bedwetting, thumb sucking. There's a lot of different ways, but they are affected emotionally by disaster. They also are economically and socially impacted by disaster. Lori Peake has done some great research on this, and what she says is a population that's already vulnerable before a disaster will be even more vulnerable after the disaster. 30% of the kids under the age of 6, when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, were already below the poverty line. Now, as emergency managers, we have a chance to help mitigate or at least recognize that vulnerability and maybe do something about it. So how else are our kids different? Well, other than being illogical little critters that don't think the same way we do, they love play. Play is magic to them. They learn physical skills, emotional skills, problem solving, and imagination building. Anyone out there seen Lego Masters? It's a show in which adults get to use those same skills, playing, imagination building, problem solving, to create masterpieces that then could win them $1 million. It makes me think that maybe I should have played with Legos a little more as a kid. Now, we talk about vulnerability. When I think about kids, I see vulnerability as rings that encircle kids. There's an emotional vulnerability ring, a physical vulnerability ring, a social or an economic vulnerability ring. But the one we haven't talked about yet is attitudinal vulnerability. So when I think of this one, I kind of go back to a favorite Tolkien quote of mine, "One ring to rule them all." And I don't necessarily mean, the end of the world Mordor kind of a way. However, I will say if you're hoping or you're counting on those hobbits to come and save your shire, it's not going to be a pretty day there when the disaster starts. We need to start focusing on that ring before the disaster starts. So what is attitudinal vulnerability? Well, simply, it goes back to the saying, attitude is everything. It is one of the most powerful and the most easiest to influence vulnerabilities out there. Helplessness, we often forget, is a learned response. Kids wake up thinking they can solve everything with a hug, a smile, a cookie, or a kiss. We tell them differently as adults. We teach them about helplessness. Instead, we can be empowering them. So how do we change things? How do we mitigate that vulnerability and rule them all? Well, we do that by focusing the outreach programs on kids. I look back at child cares in schools, and I use fire drills as a great example. How many children have we lost in schools or daycares due to fires in the last, say, 50 years? Very few. Why? Because it's part of their norm. They know what to do. If there's a fire, they get out. They've learned that. It's their new normal. Well, why aren't we doing that with earthquake preparedness or tornadoes or pick a disaster? If we change their normal and enable them to be able to cope with things, just think about how much further along they're going to be. As adults, we often look at knowledge as power. Well, with kids, knowledge is magic, and it can produce amazing results. Another one of my superheroes I want to talk about is Tilly Smith. Tilly was 10 years old when she was on vacation with her mom and dad and little sister in Thailand back in 2004. And she looked out at the water, and it was doing something really odd. It was all frothy, kind of like soda, and it was receding. Now, you hear that word receding, and we all know what that means now, but that was not the case back then. And she knew a tsunami was coming. She'd learned about it in her geography class, and she tried to convince her parents about it. But they just like, no, that's crazy. I mean, there'd been no earthquake there. They had no idea. It's like they're on vacation. These things don't happen. So they went on back to the hotel, and she wouldn't let it go. So her dad went up to the pool security guard and said, hey, I know this sounds crazy, but my daughter's convinced that there's a tsunami coming. And that's when they learned about the earthquake in Indonesia. The two men looked at each other and started rounding up everybody. That girl, that 10-year-old, probably saved hundreds of lives that day. Children can make a difference. If they know what to do and they're empowered to do it, they can help themselves and others. Not only could they be future Lego masters, they can be superheroes to their family, to their friends, and their community. And we, as emergency managers, can help them by refocusing our outreach programs on the most vulnerable and yet at the same time, the most powerful population, children. Thank you so much.